The signal came from nowhere and everywhere at once, screaming across every frequency that humanity had ever used to listen to the stars. Lieutenant Chen Wei was the first to notice it during her night shift at the Luna Deep Space Array. And she nearly spilled her coffee when the readings began flooding her screen in impossible patterns. "This cannot be right," she whispered to herself as she ran the diagnostics 3 more times. But the numbers refused to change. The signal matched a ship that had been declared lost 53 years ago. A vessel named the Prometheus that had carried 200 brave souls into the unknown and never returned. Within hours, the news reached Admiral Kenji Okonkwo at United Terran Fleet Command in Geneva. And the old soldier felt his heart skip when he read the report. He had been a young cadet when the Prometheus vanished. And he remembered watching the memorial service with tears in his eyes as the names of the lost were read aloud. Now those ghosts were coming home. "Scramble the vigilance," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "I want Captain Santos on an intercept course within the hour. Captain Yara." Santos received the orders while her ship orbited Mars, and she felt a chill run down her spine as she read the mission briefing. The Prometheus was not just returning from the void, but doing something impossible as it came. The ship was decelerating from nearly half the speed of light without any visible thrust or energy signature, as if the laws of physics themselves had decided to make an exception. "All hands to stations," Santos announced over the ship-wide comm. "We have a rendezvous with history." The Vigilance was one of the fastest ships in the fleet. But even so, the journey took 6 days as they pushed their engines to the limit. Santos spent those days reviewing everything she could find about the Prometheus mission, studying the faces of the crew who had been young and hopeful when they left Earth behind. Commander Elias Vance had been 32 years old in the departure photos, a brilliant physicist who had designed the experimental full drive that was supposed to revolutionize space travel. His wife had been pregnant when he left, promising to name their child after the first star they reached. The child would now be older than Vance had been when he vanished on the 7th day. They found the Prometheus, and Santos had to grip her command chair to keep herself steady as the ship appeared on her view screen. It was wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Hull shimmered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance whenever she tried to focus on them, and portions of the ship appeared to exist in multiple positions at the same time. Navigator reported that the sensors could not agree on the exact location of the vessel, as if it occupied several points in space simultaneously. What, in the name of everything holy, happened to that ship? Her first officer breathed aside. Santos had no answer to give him. The docking procedure took 3 hours longer than it should have because the airlocks kept refusing to align with a target that would not stay still. Finally, the connection was made, and Santos stood at the inner door with a security team at her back as the pressure equalized. When the door opened, she expected corpses or monsters or perhaps nothing at all. What she found was a man in a crisp uniform who looked exactly like the photos from 53 years ago, right down to the small scar above his left eyebrow. "Commander Elias Vance," he said, extending his hand with a tired smile that spoke of burdens she could not yet understand. "Thank you for coming to meet us, Captain." Santos shook his hand automatically, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. Behind Vance, she could see more crew members moving through the corridor, all of them young and healthy and completely unchanged from their departure photos. "You were gone for 53 years. She managed to say. Vance nodded slowly, and something in his eyes shifted like clouds passing over the sun. "From your perspective, that is true," he replied. "From ours, we have been gone for 3 days. Though those 3 days contained more than I can easily explain." He stepped back and gestured for her to enter the ship. "Please come aboard, Captain, and I will show you what we found out there in the dark between the stars." Santos followed him through corridors that hummed with energies her equipment could not identify. Past crew members who nodded politely as if this were a routine inspection rather than a resurrection. They reached the bridge where the rest of the senior staff waited. And Santos noticed that all of them carried the same weight in their eyes that she had seen in Vance. These people had witnessed to something that had changed them forever. "We did not find what we were looking for," Vance said as he took his seat in the command chair. "We found something far more significant. Something that will transform humanity if we are wise enough to use it correctly." He pulled up a holographic display that showed equations and symbols that Santos did not recognize. Mathematics that seemed to writhe and rearrange themselves as she watched. "We fell through reality itself, Captain, and we met the beings who wrote the rules of this universe." Santos felt the deck sway beneath her feet. Though the artificial gravity remained perfectly stable. "That sounds impossible," she said. Vance laughed. But there was no humor in the sound. 3 days ago I would have agreed with you. But I have since learned that the word impossible is nothing more than a confession of ignorance. He stood and walked to the main view screen, where the stars gleamed cold and distant. "Those beings gave us a gift, Captain. A single equation that allows us to rewrite the fundamental constants of physics itself. And they warned us that every other species who received this knowledge eventually destroyed themselves with it." He turned to face her. And in that moment, Santos understood why his eyes carried such terrible weight. "We have brought back the power to make humanity into gods or monsters. And now we must decide which we will become." The Prometheus hummed around them, its impossible patterns pulsing in rhythms that matched no music Santos had ever heard. Behind her, the security team stood frozen, their weapons useless against the magnitude of what they were witnessing. 53 years of silence had ended, and the universe would never be the same again. The Grand Chamber of the Terran Science Council had witnessed many historic moments over its 200 years of existence. But nothing had ever silenced it quite like the testimony of Commander Elias Vance. He stood at the center podium while 300 of the most brilliant minds in human space stared at him from their elevated seats, their faces reflecting emotions that ranged from skepticism to terror. Admiral Okonkwo sat in the observer gallery with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, watching the man who had been declared dead when the Admiral was still learning how to command a patrol boat. "We activated the full drive at the edge of the Orc cloud," Vance began, his voice steady and clear despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. "The theory predicted that we would create a shortcut through normal space, a fold in the fabric of reality that would allow us to cross light years in moments." He paused and looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "The theory was wrong. Or perhaps it was more correct than any of us could have imagined." Dr. Amara Ase stood beside him, her dark skin gleaming under the chamber lights as she pulled up a holographic display for the assembled scientists. She had been the chief physicist aboard the Prometheus, a woman whose papers on quantum mechanics had been required reading at every university on Earth. "We did not fold space," she said. "We fell through it, into a dimension that exists beneath our reality, like the code that runs beneath a computer program." The hologram showed a representation of normal space as a thin membrane floating above an ocean of swirling colors and impossible geometries. "We call it the substrate," Dar Ase continued. "It is the foundation upon which our universe is built. The place where the laws of physics are not laws at all, but merely suggestions that can be changed by those who know how." A murmur rippled through the chamber, and several council members leaned forward in their seats. Director Alana Vasquez of the Physics Division raised her hand. "You are suggesting that the fundamental constants of nature are variable," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "The speed of light, the gravitational constant, Planck's constant, all of these are fixed values that define the very structure of reality." Vance smiled, and there was sadness in his expression. That is what we believed, Director. And that belief was our greatest limitation. He gestured to Dr. Ase, who changed the holographic display to show vast shapes moving through the colorful chaos of the substrate. They were not ships or creatures in any conventional sense, but patterns of pure information that stretched across distances the human mind could not comprehend. We encountered intelligences in a substrate, Vance said. Beings that have existed since before the Big Bang. Entities that were present when the physical laws of our universe were first written. The chamber erupted in noise as council members shouted questions and objections. But Vance raised his hand and waited for silence. They are not gods in any religious sense, he continued when the noise died down. They are more like programmers, architects who design the rules by which our reality operates and then step back to watch what would evolve within their creation. Admiral Okonkwo felt his stomach tighten as he listened. He had commanded warships and led soldiers into battle. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the idea that the universe itself might be a constructed thing. These beings observed us, Dr. Ase said, taking over the narrative. They watched humanity climb from caves to cities to starships. And they found us fascinating because we accomplished everything through brute force rather than understanding. She pulled up images of human achievements. Rockets launching toward the moon. Fusion reactors igniting artificial suns. Warp drives bending space around colonial vessels. We split atoms without knowing that matter itself is just a stable pattern in the substrate. We bent light without realizing that the speed of light is just a variable in an equation. We warped space-time without understanding that space and time are merely emergent properties of something deeper. Director Vasquez stood from her seat, her face pale. What did they give you? She demanded. What knowledge could possibly justify the claims you are making? Vance nodded to Dr. Ase, who displayed a single equation on the holographic screen. It was short, barely a dozen symbols. But those symbols belonged to no mathematical language that anyone in the chamber recognized. They seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed directly, as if the equation itself was alive. This is what they gave us, Vance said quietly. A formula that allows localized modification of physical constants within a defined area of space. The chamber fell silent again. But this time, the silence was different. This was the silence of people who were beginning to understand exactly what they were hearing. With this equation, we can adjust gravity, change the speed of light, modify the rate of entropy, alter the strong and weak nuclear forces, Dr. Ase explained. We can make faster than light travel trivial. We can generate unlimited energy. We can cure any disease and reverse the aging process itself. Admiral Okonkwo rose from his seat, and every eye in the chamber turned toward him. If this is true, he said slowly, then you have brought back the power to reshape reality itself. Vance met his gaze and nodded. Yes, Admiral. That is exactly what we have done. Okonkwo felt the weight of command settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. And if we can do this, he continued, then so can our enemies. So can terrorists and madmen and anyone else who gets their hands on this knowledge. The chamber erupted once more. But Okonkwo ignored the noise as he stared at Commander Vance across the distance between them. He saw the answer in the younger man's eyes before. Vance spoke aloud. The beings warned us about that. Vance said, they told us that they have given this knowledge to other species before. Civilizations that rose and fell across billions of years. He looked around the chamber at the assembled brilliance of human science. Every single one of those species destroyed themselves within a few generations of receiving the gift. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Admiral Okonkwo had ever heard. They gave it to us anyway, he said. Why would they do that if every other species failed? Vance smiled again. And this time, There was a flicker of something that might have been hope, because they believe we might be different. Admiral, though they did not tell us why, the fate of humanity hung in the air of that ancient chamber, waiting to see what choice would be made. The containment laboratory beneath the Swiss Alps had been built to study the most dangerous materials known to humanity, but nothing it had ever held compared to what was about to happen within its reinforced walls. D'Arc stood in the center of the testing chamber, while a dozen of the world's most important people watched from behind 3 meters of transparent steel. Admiral Okonkwo was there, along with Director Vasquez and the presidents of 4 major nations, all of them wearing expressions that mixed fear with desperate curiosity. What I am about to show you is not a trick or an illusion, Dr. Asay said through the communication system, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. This is a fundamental demonstration of the principles we learned in the substrate. She held a small tablet in her hands, its screen displaying a simplified version of the equation that the beings had given them. I will begin with gravity, she announced. The force that keeps us bound to our planets and defines the structure of the cosmos itself. Her fingers moved across the tablet, entering a sequence that looked more like art than mathematics. The observers saw nothing at first, but then the small objects that had been placed around the chamber began to behave strangely. Steel ball rose from its pedestal and floated upward toward the ceiling, a cup of water lifted off the table, its contents remaining perfectly still within the container, despite being suspended in mid-air. Dr. Asay herself rose several centimeters off the floor, a lab coat drifting around her as if she were underwater. I have inverted the gravitational constant within this chamber, she explained while floating gently. What was down is now up, and objects fall toward the ceiling instead of the floor. President Chun of the Asian Coalition pressed his hand against the transparent barrier, his eyes wide with wonder. This is not possible, he whispered. But the evidence before him said otherwise. Dr. Asay touched her tablet again, and everything returned to normal, objects settling back onto their surfaces as gravity resumed its familiar direction. Now I will demonstrate something more profound, she said. The speed of light is not merely fast. It is a fundamental constant that determines the relationship between space and time itself. She created a small spherical boundary in the air before her, marking its edges with floating lights. Within this 1-meter sphere, I am going to reduce the local speed of light to approximately 1 meter per second. The observers exchanged confused glances, not fully understanding what they were about to witness. Dr. Asay picked up a small ball bearing and tossed it gently into the sphere. What happened next would haunt their dreams for years. The ball bearing entered the boundary and simply stopped. Or rather, it continued moving, but so slowly that its motion was barely perceptible. They could actually watch light crawling across its surface, could see the reflections shifting at a pace that should have been instantaneous. Time inside the sphere is now moving much slower relative to our reference frame, Dr. Asay explained. What takes a second for us takes several minutes inside the boundary. She reached in and pulled the ball bearing out, and it shot forward at normal speed, as if released from molasses. Admiral Okonkwo stepped forward, his military mind already racing through the implications. Could you do this on a larger scale? He asked. Could you create a bubble around an entire ship or a city? Dr. Asay nodded slowly. In theory, there is no upper limit to the size of the affected area, and there is no lower limit to how much we can slow or accelerate local time. Director Vasquez was furiously taking notes, her scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of direct observation. What about energy? She demanded. The amount of power required to do what you are describing should be astronomical. Dr. Asay smiled at this question, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask it. That is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all, she said. The substrate beings showed us that energy itself is a variable, not a constant. She touched her tablet one more time, and a small device in the corner of the chamber began to glow. I have just modified the local efficiency of energy conversion within that generator, she explained. It is now producing more output than input, something that should be impossible according to the laws of thermodynamics. President Morrison of the American Federation stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "You have created perpetual motion," he said, his voice cracking with the enormity of what he was hearing. "Perpetual motion and more," Dr. Ase confirmed. "Unlimited energy, unlimited resources. The ability to reshape matter itself by adjusting the fundamental forces that hold atoms together." She looked through the transparent barrier at the faces of the people who would decide the fate of her species. "We can cure every disease by reprogramming the biological constants that allow illness to exist. We can reverse aging by adjusting the entropic processes that cause cellular decay. We can terraform planets in days instead of centuries by rewriting the rules of chemistry and geology." The observers stood in stunned silence as the implications washed over them. Amaro Okonkwo was the first to speak, and his words cut through the wonder like a blade. "If we can do this to cure disease," he said slowly, "then we can also do it to create disease, to cause plagues that no medicine could treat, because the very laws of biology would be turned against us." Dr. Ose's smile faded. "Yes, Admiral, that is correct. And if we can terraform planets," he continued, "then we can also destroy them, can unmake worlds by changing the constants that hold matter together." "Also correct." The Admiral turned to face the other observers, his expression grim. "You have given us the power of gods," he said, "but we are not gods. We are humans with all our flaws and hatreds and fears." He pointed at the floating objects that Dr. Ase had demonstrated. "Every rival nation, every terrorist organization, every madman with a grudge will want this knowledge. And some of them will get it no matter how hard we try to keep it secret." President Chan nodded gravely. "The balance of power that has kept peace for 2 centuries is about to be destroyed," he said. "When everyone can reshape reality, what is to stop anyone from doing whatever they want?" Dr. Ase bowed her head, and when she raised it again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That is exactly the question the substrate beings asked us," she said quietly. "And they told us that every other species answered it by destroying themselves." The containment laboratory suddenly felt very small, and the weight of the universe pressed down upon everyone present. They had been given infinite power, and now they had to decide whether humanity was wise enough to survive it. The secret lasted exactly 17 days before it exploded across every news network and social platform in human space. Someone had leaked the footage from the containment laboratory, and now 8 billion humans on Earth and another 3 billion scattered across the colonies were watching Dr. Ase float in the air, while physics itself bent around her like a servant. Commander Elias Vance watched the chaos unfold from his quarters aboard the Prometheus, which remained in orbit around Earth while governments argued about what to do with them. His crew had become prisoners without chains, kept isolated from a world that did not know whether to worship them or fear them. "They are already dividing," he said to Dr. Ase, who sat across from him with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "Just as the beings warned us they would." On the screens around them, they could see the factions forming in real time. The Ascensionists had emerged first, a movement led by brilliant scientists and idealistic dreamers who believed humanity should embrace the substrate knowledge fully. Their leader was a charismatic physicist named Dr. Paulo Reyes, who gave speeches to crowds of thousands, promising that humanity could transcend its biological limitations and join the cosmic beings as equals. "We have been given the keys to paradise," he proclaimed from a stage in Singapore. Only cowardice and small thinking can stop us from walking through the door. The preservationists rose in opposition. Religious groups and cautious philosophers who demanded that the knowledge be destroyed before it could. Corrupt humanity Cardinal Sofia Martinez spoke for them from the Vatican, her aged voice trembling with conviction. "This is the forbidden fruit of Eden offered to us again," she declared. "The serpent comes with promises of godhood, but the price is our very souls." Between these extremes stood the militarists, hardened pragmatists who cared nothing for transcendence or salvation, but only for power general. Marcus Stone of the European Defense Forces spoke bluntly at a closed session of military leaders. "It does not matter what we think this knowledge should be used for," he said. "What matters is what our enemies will do with it. And we must be ready to act first." The colonies were worst of all. Old resentments boiling over as Mars and the outer settlements saw their chance to break free from Earth's control. The Colonial Liberation Front issued a statement demanding equal access to the substrate technology. For too long, Earth has kept the colonies dependent and weak. They broadcast from their hidden bases. This new knowledge belongs to all of humanity, not just the governments that have oppressed us. Vance turned off the screens when the first reports of violence began coming in. A laboratory in Brazil had been bombed by preservationist extremists, killing 40 researchers. An ascensionist rally in Moscow had turned into a riot when counter-protesters attacked with weapons. A colonial freighter had been seized by liberation fighters who believed it was carrying substrate research data. "This is exactly what they told us would happen," Dr. Assay said quietly. "The pattern is repeating, just as it did for every other species." Vance nodded and pulled up a holographic display showing the equation they had brought back from the void. "They gave us this knowledge knowing what it would do to us," he said. "Why would they do that if they knew we would tear ourselves apart?" Dr. Assay had been asking herself the same question for weeks, and she had finally found something that might be an answer. "There is more to the equation than we first realized," she said. "Hidden layers that only reveal themselves when you study the structure deeply enough." She modified the display to show patterns within patterns, meanings beneath meanings. "The substrate beings did not just give us the ability to rewrite physics," she explained. "They gave us the ability to rewrite ourselves." Vance leaned forward, his exhausted eyes suddenly sharp with attention. "What do you mean?" Dr. Assay pointed to a cluster of symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "This portion of the equation relates to consciousness itself, to the neural patterns that make us who we are." She took a deep breath before continuing. "We can use this to encode new values directly into human neurology, to change how we think and feel, and make decisions at the most fundamental level." Vance felt cold terror wash through him. "You were talking about mind control," he said. "About rewriting human nature itself." "I am talking about evolution," Dr. Assay replied. "Deliberate, conscious evolution chosen by humanity rather than imposed by random chance." She stood and walked to the viewport, looking down at the Earth, turning slowly below them. "The beings gave us a choice, Commander. A choice that every other species failed to make correctly." She turned to face him, and her expression was more serious than he had ever seen it. "We can use this power to change the universe around us, to reshape reality according to our desires and our fears." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Or we can use it to change ourselves, to become the kind of species that can be trusted with such power." Before Vance could respond, an alarm shrieked through the ship. "Emergency transmission from Mars colony," the computer announced. "Major attack in progress." They rushed to the bridge and watched in horror as the reports came in. Separatist faction had somehow obtained crude substrate manipulation technology, and they had used it to collapse the gravity in Dome 7 of New Shanghai. Thousands of people were dead, crushed against ceilings or torn apart by impossible forces. The colonial governor was screaming for military intervention, and Earth's government was already preparing a response that would use the same terrible power to retaliate. "This is how it begins," Vance said, watching the death toll climb on his screens. "This is how we destroy ourselves." Dr. Assay gripped his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Then we have to find another way," she said fiercely. "The beings believed we could be different, and we have to prove them right." Outside the viewport, the stars looked down on humanity's crisis, ancient and patient and waiting to see what choice would be made. Admiral Kenji Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and looked out at the fleet of ships that had gathered around them in orbit. There were warships from Earth and colonial vessels from Mars, corporate transports and scientific cruisers, representatives from every faction and nation and ideology that was tearing humanity apart. He had called them here with a message that cut through all the fighting and the fear. Come to the Prometheus. He had broadcast on every frequency, or watch humanity destroy itself within a generation. They had come, not because they trusted him or agreed with him, but because deep down they all knew he was right. The conference chamber of the TO. Prometheus had never been designed to hold this many people, but somehow they made it work. Ascensionists sat across from preservationists. Militarists glared at colonial liberators. Politicians and priests and scientists all crowded together in a space that hummed with the impossible energies of the ship commander. Elias Vance stood at the center of them all, looking older than his unaged face suggested. 53 years had passed for the universe, while only 3 days had passed for him. And in those 3 days he had seen things that no human was ever meant to witness. "You all know why you are here," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "You have seen what the substrate technology can do, and you have seen what it is already doing to us." He gestured to a holographic display showing the destruction on Mars, the riots on Earth, the ships firing on each other in the asteroid belt. "We received a gift from beings older than the stars, and we are using it to murder each other." Cardinal Martinez rose from her seat, her robes flowing around her like shadows. "Then the answer is clear," she declared. "This knowledge must be destroyed before it destroys us, locked away forever where no one can reach it." Dr. Paulo Reyes jumped up to oppose her. "That is the thinking of frightened children," he shouted. "We cannot unlearn what we have learned. We can only move forward into the future that awaits us." General Stone stood as well, his military uniform a stark contrast to the other speakers. "While you argue philosophy, our enemies are developing weapons that will make nuclear bombs look like toys," he said coldly. "We must strike first or be destroyed." The chamber erupted into chaos, voices shouting over each other, old hatreds and new fears colliding in a storm of human emotion. Vance let them rage for a moment before raising his hand when he spoke again. His voice was quiet, but somehow it cut through all the noise. "The substrate beings told me something before we left them," he said. "Something I have been trying to understand ever since." The chamber slowly fell silent as everyone turned to listen. "They told me that they have given this knowledge to 17 different species across billions of years, and every single one of those species destroyed themselves with it." He looked around at the faces watching him, the fear and anger and desperate hope reflected there. Every species tried to use the power for domination, to crush their enemies, to make themselves invincible, to become gods who answered to no one. His voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that had been building since he first fell through reality into the substrate, and every single time, that path led to extinction. Admiral Okonkwo stepped forward to stand beside him. "Then why did they give it to us?" the Admiral asked, speaking the question that everyone was thinking. "If they knew we would fail, why take the risk?" Vance smiled, and for the first time since his return, there was genuine hope in his expression. "Because humans are different," he said. "Not better," Not wiser, not more virtuous, but different in one crucial way. He pulled up images on the holographic display. Images from human history, people building pyramids together, astronauts shaking hands in orbit, colony ships launching with crews from 100 different nations. Every other species that reached the stars did so through individual genius or ruthless conquest, he explained. They built empires of dominance and control. Hierarchies where the strong ruled the weak. He pointed to the images one by one. But humans reached the stars through cooperation, through millions of people working together toward goals that none of them could achieve alone. Dr. Asay stepped forward, her tablet glowing with the hidden equations she had discovered. The beings bet that we might be the first species to make a different choice, she said. Not to use this power for domination, but to use it for connection. She displayed the deeper layer of the substrate equation, the portion that dealt with consciousness and choice. We can rewrite the rules of physics, she explained. But we can also write new rules for ourselves, constraints that we choose to accept voluntarily. General Stone scoffed from his seat. You are asking us to chain ourselves, he said, to give up power when our enemies will not. No, Dr. Asay replied firmly. I am asking us to chain ourselves to each other. She modified the holographic display to show what she was proposing. This equation can lock substrate manipulation behind a consensus requirement, making it physically impossible for any individual or faction to use the technology without the agreement of others. The chamber stirred with murmurs and whispers. It would bind humanity together, she continued, making cooperation not just advisable, but literally necessary for accessing the deeper powers of reality. Cardinal Martinez rose slowly, her ancient face thoughtful. You are proposing to make brotherhood a law of nature, she said, to encode our highest ideals into the very fabric of the universe. Yes, Dr. Asay replied simply. That is exactly what I am proposing. The debate that followed lasted for hours, voices rising and falling as the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Some called it wisdom, while others called it chains. Some saw salvation, while others saw surrender. But in the end, when the vote was called, it passed by a margin of 7 votes. Admiral Okonkwo watched as Dr. Asay entered the final sequence into her tablet, the equation that would change what it meant to be human. The air around them shimmered as reality itself shifted, as new rules wrote themselves into the foundation of existence. And somewhere in the substrate, vast intelligences that had watched 17 species fail suddenly felt something they had not experienced in eons. Hope. A century later, human ships traveled the galaxy using substrate technology. But no world had been conquered, and no species had been subjugated. Humanity met other civilizations and offered them the same choice they had been offered, and the same wisdom they had learned. The Prometheus hung in a museum orbit around Earth, preserved as a monument to the moment when everything changed. Admiral Okonkwo, now long dead but remembered forever, had written the dedication that was engraved on a plaque at the entrance. We were given the power to become gods, but we chose instead to become human. And in the depths of the substrate, the ancient beings who had written the rules of the universe added a new constant to their equations. They called it the human constant, and it meant hope.